Okay, I did that, but I'm not sure what I'm doing. So,
That's
uh,
fine. I just called Shannon and the phone went directly to, not available. So there might be an outage or something there, quite literally. So why don't we proceed? Walt, do you have the ability? Yeah, you're already sharing your screen. So we're
I'm
recording.
good.
We can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Are we done with that Q&A phase? And you want to go right into this presentation now?
Yeah, I don't see
Just want
any
to
other
clarify that.
questions. And by the way, I posted in the chat that the COP is the construction operations plan for those of you who don't know that acronym.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will go, and hopefully we'll get Shannon back pretty soon. So I'm Walt Musial. I'm principal engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I lead the offshore wind program there. I started that back around 2003, and a lot of what we've been doing is laying the groundwork for the industry that's forming now and that we've been hearing about. I have a presentation here that is very close to what I presented yesterday at the task force meeting, so I apologize for the repetition. I feel like we've got a more intimate audience today, so maybe we can go into some of the issues that maybe weren't obviously needed to go into yesterday. So I'll just, and I'm controlling my own screen today. So I'm going to talk, I'm going to repeat this industry overview that is based on our market report that we just published in August. I'll look at a little bit more of the technology, a little bit, Jason, beyond maybe what you just said. I'll just talk a little bit about the technology options, and then primarily I want to cover the two studies that we've just published this month related to the cost of energy in Oregon and the grid study. With the grid study, I will just give you a teaser. Josh and Marty, who published that report just 3 days ago, will be presenting that next week on this the second session of this briefing, and then I'll just do some conclusions here. So just to repeat some of the stuff that we did yesterday, this is an up-to-date version as of end of last year, really, of the offshore wind industry. 33 gigawatts installed, almost all of it in shallow water, shallow being less than 60 meters. Of course, we've talked about this, that Oregon is 97% above 60 meters, and whatever is less than 60 meters is close to shore and probably off limits for development. So we're looking at floating technologies, which only have 79 megawatts installed so far globally. That was actually as of the last counting at the end of December. But as many of you know, there's been at least 2 installations this year. One was the Henrik Stevedale Tetraspar, which is a prototype, promising technology in Norway, only 3.6 megawatts, but also the Kincardine project, which I have a picture of. So all told, we've got about, we're probably well past 33 gigawatts, but this was as of the end of December. And the additions last year are tallied into these numbers that show UK leading behind with China and Germany, Netherlands, and China is catching up in a big way. I think my personal opinion is that the future of floating wind energy is going to be bigger than the fixed bottom, and simply because the resource is so much bigger and the siting options will be so much bigger. So there's no cost or technological barriers that would prevent floating wind turbines from being more expensive or more difficult in the long run. But currently, the technology is nascent, the costs are higher, and that's what we're working toward trying to resolve in the next decade. So as Jason pointed out, there's 3 technology archetypes, and now these aren't commercial systems. These are ways that we control static stability and basically keeping the machine from flipping over. big difference is that these are buoyant platforms that achieve static stability in different ways. So the spar is deep draft system, as Jason mentioned. So it's difficult to be able to take a spar and tow it into a port facility, for example, unless you have a different way of doing it. And that's what Henrik Stiesdale has tried to accomplish in the TetraSpar, which is a deployable ballast weight. So it starts out as a shallow water draft that can be pre-assembled in port. And then once you tow it out, the ballast weight can be deployed and you can achieve that deep draft. The semi-submersible in the middle is the naturally shallow draft. It uses buoyancy at the water plane to achieve static stability, and has these both the spar and the semi-submersible have the catenary moorings. The challenges for these are semi-submersibles are higher exposure to waves, which have to be mitigated through the hydrodynamic design of the system, which is achievable, but you still are adding material and systems so that it can be more impervious to waves. And then tension leg platforms on the right are probably the most difficult to deploy in the purest form, but they are very stable once they are deployed. The difficulty is the expense and the complexity of installing them, and then also the additional high vertical mooring loads that are required. So they have different types of anchoring systems. But the big benefit of TLPs, which, as Jason showed, are derived from oil and gas, is that they have the smallest footprint. So when we get into the very deep waters off the coast, there's going to be some challenges in managing the footprint that all these systems have, and the mooring systems will be a big part of that discussion. So this chart just shows the where we are today. The dotted line is the deployment so far, and this is showing that commercial development really is imminent. Next 2 or 3 years, we're going to start seeing bigger projects. Bigger projects mean lower cost per kilowatt hour per unit of energy, and that's what we're all trying to achieve. I'll probably talk more about that later. The only project in the United States that's using commercial scale turbines and is likely to be installed in the next few years is the Maine's Aquaventus project, which has been underway for several years now. And I think they've pushed that back to about 2024, but we'll have to check on that. This 3.6 gigawatts of deployment is based on projects that have been announced. This is a picture of the Kincardine project in Scotland, newest project and the biggest project, 50 megawatts, 5 turbines, and these are the largest floating turbines in existence right now, 9.5 megawatt Vestas turbines on semi-submersible principal power platforms. And I haven't got any information on how it's doing, but it's been this is a picture of its right after installation, courtesy of Principal Power. So I'm going to talk about our cost modeling and studies that were funded by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We've been working very closely with Nessie and Whitney to develop this work. It was based on a previous study that we published in 2019, and in that study we investigated quite a few things, including the cost premium that one experiences in building these pilot projects. We saw that, if we compared it to one of the pilot projects that was proposed in Oregon back in 2014 by Principal Power, the smaller 25 megawatt project costs 3 times more than a larger project that we scaled up to 1,000 megawatts. So the size of the project does matter. That's why this project scale is being emphasized and is so important, and why we need to industrialize the floating the floating manufacturing system so that we can build commercial scale projects. On the costs study, we published that on October 4th. It's really just a PowerPoint presentation, but it builds on this previous study, and we have LCOE estimates, and the grid study was just published on the 19th. Josh will talk about that next week, as I said, and that's looking at the value of the grid to the Oregon grid system, mostly on the land-based side. And again, I just want to caveat all of this, that none of these studies looked at marine spatial planning and shouldn't be construed as any endorsement of a particular site. And the links on the bottom are of the two reports, if you can click on them, if you want to read the whole thing, which you probably need to if you're interested, because I can't really do them justice in this presentation. So our model is called ORCA, and it's the offshore regional cost analyzer. It looks at geospatial characteristics and variables that affect cost, like depth, distance to shore, length of the cables, the resource. And it also looks temporally at how technology is changing with time out to 2032. And those changes in cost are based on mostly on learning curve effects and on technology timelines that address turbine size and turbine growth. The financial information is in there, and there's some models for O&M decision making. And it's continuously updated. Whatever I did last year is probably going to have to be updated this year as well. We chose a semi-submersible because it's the most common system, and it's we have the best cost information on it, and it's been proposed by more developers so far. And so we're modeling that system, pretty much a principal power type design, but it's a hybrid, I would say. It's not directly the principal power design. And then we chose turbine growth patterns that are based on what we believe the industry is going to do. And the chart is really showing how the costs decline with turbine size. If you start with our baseline year, which of course is gone by and it's passed, but we use it to build on and to reference. There's an 8 megawatt assumption for 2019. That's the turbine you could have installed in 2019. In 2022, that goes up to 10 megawatts. You can't buy a 12 megawatt right now for a project that's being built, but by 2027 you will be able to. And in fact, GE's upgraded theirs for Vineyard Wind to about a 13 right now. So those will be commercially available very soon, but they're not yet. And then as we go to further out, there's the Siemens 14 megawatt machine, which is under development. It hasn't been, the prototype hasn't been flown yet. And the Vestas 15 megawatt, which is also under development, expected to be developed by 2024. Our experience is that it takes about 4 years to go from prototype to commercial development. So by 2030, we should be able to purchase off the shelf 15 megawatt turbines, no problem. Maybe even sooner than that, but that's what our assumptions are in this model. We also look at plant size. As I said, that's an important variable. Substructure costs go down with turbine size, so we can factor that into the model. And the lower balance of system costs have cascading effects on soft costs. And one thing that I need to mention is that the ports and the bulk transmission are not included in the study. Those are additional. We also haven't really accounted for the land-based part of the transmission system, which would have to be included and calculated once we know where the substations are and where the actual ports are. From a plant perspective, we have done the wake loss analysis using 7D spacing, but we're not recommending that. That's not an optimum system. It's just a conservative way of calculating wake losses. And we have a much better wake loss model in general for the numbers that we generated in this study. I want to emphasize that the ports are necessary, and this is kind of a breakdown of what a port would have to look like. I think Jason did a really good job of that, without saying necessarily where that port should be. I think Oregon would need a port in order to facilitate an industry on the scale of 3 gigawatts or more. The study area that we looked at is bounded by the 1,300 meter isobath on the west side. And I think Nessie did a really good job of showing why we chose that. The north and the south of the state boundaries, and the east is the federal state boundary, which divides those jurisdictions. So you can see the study area is labeled there, and that's the area that we looked at. We didn't see any great advantage in terms of bathymetry in going deeper. I'm reporting also on the new resource study here. This was just the first time we were able to use it. We incorporated that into the study. It's for this, we're calling it the ORWA 20 study, which is Oregon, Washington, which was independently calculated using the same parameters that we used to develop the California study, which showed up to 1.8 meter per second increases in the wind speed over the earlier wind toolkit data that we were using before. This is the best assessment that we have for resource in this area, and we recommend that it gets used in place of whatever has been used in the past. And you can see that the gradients on this map run from about 8 meters per second in the north to almost 11 meters per second in the south. Big gradient, mostly due to the increase in summer winds down south, which don't happen in the north for some reason. And so centrally and southerly, we might see the best plants. And just for comparison, the bands that we see around 9.5 meters per second are comparable to what we're seeing in the Massachusetts wind energy area. So just off of Coos Bay is a similar wind speed to the Massachusetts, say New York Bight. The bathymetry, which I've already really covered, this is the map showing that, and Nessie covered it as well. In addition to the deepness, which developers, and Kevin Bannister, when he gives his talk, he can refute or back me up on this, but I think steep slopes matter more to developers' anchor placement than the depth itself, but both at cost, and some steep slopes may be prohibitive. So we didn't really look at the resource deeper than 1,300 for a lot of reasons, because really you don't get any more additional land ocean area because it drops off so fast. When it comes to the grid, this is a really interesting issue, and it's unique to Oregon, but you've got this coastal communities that are all up and down the coast, and there's no generation on the coast, so all the power is generated inland and flows across these lines east-west to the coast. So if offshore wind is built in the study area someplace, the power will be delivered and distributed to these areas, and will reverse the flow along these lines in such a way that we could reduce the burden on the whole grid transmission system inland. And that's what this study that was funded by BOEM and published just recently by Josh and Marty Schwartz talks about. I have a couple slides here to just go over that, but I won't go into the details. The 5 we looked at 5 scenario parameters that define these. Three levels of penetration: 0, 2.6, and 5. Looked at the parameters on the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, two different levels there: transcoastal transmission expansion, co-located energy storage, which enhances or extends the possibility of further offshore wind. We found that this one of the findings, one of the key findings was that you could put about 2.6 gigawatts offshore in Oregon and without major upgrades to the transmission system. And so there's some high value to the for offshore wind to the transmission system beyond just the carbon reduction potential that it offers. And I won't go into all of these because I want to leave time for Q&A. But these generating profiles are shown on the side. And when you see Marty's, when you see, I'm not sure if it's going to be Marty or Josh, but when you see their presentation next week, this will be a lot more detailed. So thanks for your patience on that. Our study here looked at these heat maps. This is I just left a couple in here for this discussion. This is showing net capacity factors, which really don't change over time. If you go from left to right, it's just each year we calculated these effects until we get out to 2032, which is in the sweet spot of where we think development might be happening in Oregon and on the West Coast for floating. So these values are showing, very high capacity factors, up to 50 to 60%, and that's what we think we can get from these areas. This is the LCOE heat maps showing kind of the same progression. The left side is the heat map for 2019, the base year. But when you get out to 2032, we see the effects of some of this technology development and project size growth, where the costs drop down quite a bit. And I should mention that the learning curve assumptions were that it's a global industry. By 2030, we expected to see 8 gigawatts of floating wind globally, which I think is a pretty conservative assumption based on what we're seeing out there. So according to this model, the LCOE is between $75 per megawatt hour in the north and all the way down to about $50 per megawatt hour in the south, not including the port facilities, not including some of the grid and transmission upgrades that have to happen. But that gives kind of a ballpark, and it's important for planning and for decision making to have these numbers. So we're happy to have had the opportunity to do this modeling and get to that point. But my conclusions are that really floating wind is needed for Oregon if offshore is going to be an energy source that Oregon can depend on. It will certainly enhance the zero carbon mix on the West Coast and in the Pacific Northwest. The grid study that we did and we just published is showing significant benefits for the offshore transmission system on land. I'm going to let those guys expound on that, but the no wires alternatives, there's several different scenarios that show this as being positive. The cost study showed that we can get the costs down to about 75 to as low as $50 per megawatt in the south because of the high winds that are there. There will be a need for a marshalling port. Not saying where, but Coos Bay has been mentioned by many as a likely or a potential spot. So I'm not the right person to declare that, but that is, and maybe Shannon and others can talk about that. But there are significant other economic benefits that are also available with this type of an industry, up to a $10 billion industrial output, which could translate to a lot of jobs and other things. So I'll stop there. Hopefully I didn't go over too much. Got some references for people who want to explore these further. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Walt. It looks like Jason Searman has his hand up. So we'll turn it over to Jason, but just real quick reference regarding Coos Bay. We do have Moffett and Nickel who are conducting a port infrastructure feasibility assessment starting with Coos Bay, and that work is funded with BOEM as well. So we should know a lot more about just what that may or may not look like, and what kind of infrastructure upgrades would be required for Coos Bay to be one of a couple, at least, marshaling ports on the West Coast. Jason Searman.
Hey, Walt, this is Jason.
Hi, Jason.
I've been using like a back of the envelope approximation of 1 gigawatt, maybe to be about 100 square miles. And maybe that 7D slide, you could go back to that one. But I was just curious how what is that like a good benchmark? Did that match up with that 7D slide?
This one here.
Yeah.
I think this 7D will underestimate the land area that's necessary. I think 7D is something like 5 or 6 megawatts per square kilometer. I'm trying to do it in square miles. I have to do the conversion, but our rule of thumb is 3 megawatts per square kilometer, or about roughly, I think it comes out to about 350 square kilometers for 1,000 gig, or for a gigawatt. And I think,
Yeah, I don't have my calculator out.
I think my from memory, someone needs to check me on this, but I think square miles, it's something like 120.
Yeah, I was curious. I like the miles one just because I guess,
Yeah,
you know, well, I would prefer kilometers, but I guess I'm part of the stubborn American metrics or non-metric system.
well, my hesitancy to use miles is it gets confused with nautical miles, and then I always have to ask which one you're talking about unless it's clearly specified.
So on that next slide, I had a question about your scale because you use miles on that next one, 13.
Sorry.
Or maybe 14. I don't know.
This one?
Yeah. So is that the scale? Is that little concentric circle with the 10 miles, which would be about 100 square miles?
I had a kind of a row with my mapping people about not having a scale on this map, but that this was their. We lost it when they were doing one of the conversions, but this is to scale. Yes, that was the intent.
So, you know, that rough 100 square miles, you know, I don't know what the value is for everybody on this call, but it's helpful for me to visualize it, you know, even if it's not perfect, roughly, you know, that circle that would be a gigawatt, you know, as I'm understanding it, right?
I haven't done the geometry on that, but that seems about right. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, a gigawatt. A gigawatt. I'm not. Are you looking at the small one or the big one?
The yellow 10-mile radius, you know, that should be around 100 square miles, rough, give or take, you know, a little bit.
Sorry.
Or no, it would be.
Yeah.
Sorry, that would be the 5. The 5 would be the 100.
Yeah, that's more like it, I think. I mean, roughly, I did the math. 3 gigawatts would be about 3.5% of the resource area in that about 3.5% of the study area.
Yeah, I was just trying to visualize.
Including state waters, I think. That was my rough math on that one.
I notice Whitney has dropped a couple of links in there. One, there's a link to the LCOE study, and she's also dropped the link for the port study that I referenced.
Thanks, Whitney.
Let's take a look. Are there any other hands raised? I'm not seeing any. Well, I think you're off the hook as always. Really informative presentation, and thanks for making time for us again. We're very much looking forward to your staff's presentation next week.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
And next up, we have Jason. There are so many Jasons that we're working with in this sector. I'm just going to call everyone Jason. Actually, we have Kevin Bannister who is working with Jason Eisdorfer. So there we go.
Shannon, real
But
quick,
Kevin
I saw
Bannister from Simply Blue.
just real quick, I
And
saw a hand raised momentarily there. I'm not sure if we wanted to take a question. Now it's down. I
okay,
don't know
let's
who it
see.
was, so maybe never mind.
If you have a question right now while Jason or while Kevin is pulling up his slide deck, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Looks like not. And Kevin, I don't know, do you have a slide deck?
I do. Are you not seeing? Oh, I need to hit share. There we go. Tell me if that's
There we
showing
go.
up
Looking
the way it's
good.
We got it.
supposed to. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Shannon, and thank you really to everyone. I mean, so far, I feel like I should practically just hang up. This has been such a fascinating and well-prepared conversation, and it's always so great to hear from you, Walt, because you provide such a great overview. But I am really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you all. So I'll work through these slides, and I've tried to be responsive, Shannon, to the topics that you asked that we address. And as I go through, feel free to interrupt, or we can take questions at the end, or whatever's easiest to keep the conversation rolling. So let me try to get this working here. Okay, so just through this, I'll do some quick introductions to who we are. Give a little bit of a global offshore wind perspective, and then talk further about the implications of integrating offshore wind into Oregon's energy future. So there are a couple introductions that are required here. So first, I think, is the Simply Blue group itself. So Simply Blue is a blue economy developer that's based in Southern Ireland. And let me ask if you can see my cursor here as well?
Yes,
Shan?
we can.
You
Yep.
can, good. Okay, so
Yes, we
Cork
can.
is great. So Cork is actually right down here, and it so happens to be I think the world's second largest deep water port or harbor. So it has some real specific attributes that make it an interesting place for us to consider launching an offshore wind business. But we also have offices in the UK and in Hamburg, Germany, and then here in Portland, Oregon, where I'm based and where the joint venture that I'll talk about a little bit further is also centered. So as it relates to offshore wind, Simply Blue is a pure play floating wind developer. We do have about 3.5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind projects that are under development in the UK and Ireland. And I'll emphasize again that these are all floating. None of what we're doing in the floating wind space is bottom fixed, all floating. Some of these projects are a couple of years old now, so we've over these last couple of years, we've developed quite a bit of unique experience
on my desk.
that relates to permitting, the engineering aspects, the commercial relationships associated with the foundation suppliers, the turbine manufacturers, the supply chain, and then of course some of the partnerships that I'll talk about in just a second. So these projects are under joint ventures with Total Energies, formerly known as Total, for a portfolio of about 400 megawatts in this area in the southwest of the UK. Off of Ireland, we're operating under a joint venture with Shell. And then up in the northern part up here in Scotland, we have a smaller project, a 200 megawatt project that's being developed under a joint venture with Subsea 7, which is a Norwegian company, part of the oil and gas services industry. So Jason, your questions about, where does oil and gas fit in this? Quite substantially, clearly. And in the UK, Aberdeen, which is located right in here, long been sort of the beating heart of the UK's offshore oil and gas industry, has transitioned almost entirely to become a floating wind hub. At least that's what Scottish government and UK government is trying to make of it. Because similar to Oregon, most of the water, good portion of the water offshore Scotland will require the deployment of floating technologies. So this is who Simply Blue is. But it's also important to introduce Total Energies because they are our joint venture partner here for the development of floating wind projects in the US. And Total Energies is one of the world's largest energy companies. I think what's most important about Total Energies is not only are they one of the largest, but they have one of the most impressive ambitions as it relates to the deployment of renewables globally. So their ambition is to install 100 gigawatts of renewables around the globe by 2030. When you think about that, the scale of that aspiration, it's frankly mind-boggling. They do have bottom-fixed projects that they're working on. I believe they intend to bid here in New York and some of the existing U.S. bottom-fixed opportunities, other projects that they have under development around the world. But key for us is that their floating pipeline includes something like 3 gigawatts of floating projects that they have under development. So between our company and theirs, we have something like 6 gigawatts of floating projects that are in various stages of development around the world. I think, Jason, this slide will help to answer some of your question about, what are the implications? And I think you actually had it pretty close to right. So when we look at the sort of the marriage of our companies together for this joint venture, we see Total Energy's really unparalleled experience with the sort of management of complex offshore projects. Their understanding of how the supply chain is key and integral towards the efficient deployment of facilities like these. Their record with HSEQ, safety issues offshore. Of course, the resources that they can bring to bear to this type of project development is key. Offshore projects are complex and expensive, largely because of their capacity. And so having those types of sort of skills, experience, resources that can be brought to bear to the projects is massively important, ultimately to the efficient deployment of these sort of systems, which leads to reduced costs for everyone. And then with Simply Blue, I'll describe who the team is here in a second, but we have a real sort of depth of experience, some veterans of the offshore wind space here in the US. And I'll just sort of share who's heading up the team now. And I think it's worth just spending maybe 10 seconds or so on each of these individuals. So I'm Kevin Bannister there, top left. I was with Principal Power for about 10 years. Prior to working with Simply Blue, you've seen the images of the wind float in a couple of these slides. So the sort of iconic floating wind foundation with the 3 yellow columns. I'm quite familiar with that technology, having sought to project it into global project development pipelines for almost 10 years. Important to note that Simply Blue does not have any particular technology focus. We're not required to work with wind float or any specific technology. What we intend to use is the floating foundation that will be best suited for the projects that we have under development. David Fallon is the head of the offshore wind US group for Total Energies, based out of Houston. And then Stephanie McClellan, a real pioneer in the industry who is responsible for so much of what we've seen on the policy development side, the supply chain development side, in particular in the Northeast of the US. Alana Dewar, who formerly headed up the US Department of Energy's R&D program for offshore wind, and more recently headed up DNV's advisory services for North America for offshore wind. Carolina Paytrek, who worked for ENBW as they initiated project development activities in California, but also on the East Coast, where she set up the office and was led the auction process that Nessie was starting to describe for BOEM. And then, of course, Jason Eisdorfer, who I suspect that many of you know and know well. So that is the team that comprises our joint venture, and we're bringing additional individuals on over the course of the sort of ensuing weeks and months. And I guess just taking one step back, the announcement of our joint venture was made last week, just at the AWEA Now ACP, American Clean Power Association conference in Boston. And I think that we felt that there was quite a buzz about it. So we're coming from a pretty excited place. So I will try quickly. Again, can't match Walt's expertise or really robust and substantive presentation, but I'll just try to hit on a couple of the key points. Maybe again, and that's, I think, key among the points is that the global floating offshore wind pipeline is growing rapidly. it almost doesn't matter what the numbers are because, as Jason Bush said earlier, they're changing so rapidly. To keep track is almost a full-time job in and of itself. But what's maybe most important is to just have a look at the trend line on the curve, and what kind of confidence that can give us about the foundation's evolution, and how hard those the foundation designers are working to sort of continually improve the industrialization processes that they have, so that these foundations can indeed meet the promise that we see that floating wind brings to markets like Oregon, where the wind resource is absolutely world-class and maybe one of the best assets that the state has. So I'll just say the DNV, another third-party credible, along with NREL, is projecting something like 250 gigawatts of floating projects over the next couple decades, which is just absolutely remarkable growth. With that, and partially because of that, we are seeing costs declining rapidly. I think Walt obviously did a great job describing where we can project costs to go in the state of Oregon, but this is not only NREL's analysis that suggests that costs will decline rapidly. This is another DNV figure and shows similar sort of results. Something in the order of 5 cents or $50 a megawatt hour by the end of the decade. This here is in euros, so maybe 53 or 54 dollars per megawatt hour by the turn of this next decade. And there were a lot of reasons. Again, Walt mentioned that there's no reason to think that costs can't decline in the floating world, just as they have in the bottom fixed world. And when you do look at where the costs have gone over the last decade or so, it's really been quite astonishing to see the costs fall through the floor for offshore wind. And a couple of the key areas that we've seen that have been responsible for those declines, obviously the increase in turbine size. Economies of scale matter in offshore wind. Larger turbines means fewer foundations that need to be deployed or installed to reach whatever project capacity you're trying to reach. And then I think a key has been the stability of the financing costs and really the low cost to finance these projects. And that's a really key indicator, because those sort of in global industry who tend to be most risk averse, be they the banks or the pension funds, have come to understand that offshore wind is a great investment and a low risk investment that can provide stable returns over the life of their projects. Key thing for all of us to think about. And in my prior role with Principal Power, I saw that the financing costs for the floating wind projects, like some that we've talked about, like the Kincardine project, the 50 megawatt project, now the largest floating wind project in the world, was receiving the same sort of treatment from the banks. Low financing costs, which will obviously translate as projects get bigger and the foundation designs continue to mature and are deployed around the world. So what we've seen so far is really the small scale projects, again, with 50 being the largest. That will followed shortly by a project called the Tampin project that Equinor is promoting. That'll be 88 megawatts. It may be larger than that. The original proposal was for 88. I think they want to deploy 11 foundations, but it may be hard for them to buy an 8 megawatt turbine these days. But as you can see from this bubble chart, as you move into the latter half of the decade, the projects that are proposed get bigger and bigger. In particular in Asia, we see some very, very large projects that are proposed. There are Korean projects that are proposing multiple gigawatts of capacity. And quite frankly, I would expect them to get built. We talk about infrastructure here in the West Coast. Korea does not have any of those issues about the need for further investment in infrastructure. Indeed, they have infrastructure that's ready to go and well suited for near term and near shore, well, I should say within their waters, near water deployments for floating offshore wind. So the trend lines are really clear, and the US is right along sort of the global trajectory where the opportunities for floating are becoming really, really impossible to ignore. One of the reasons why, we've talked about this a little bit, but what are the capacity factors that we'd expect to see from these projects? Hywind Scotland, the first multi-turbine floating offshore wind project that we've talked a little bit about, has a lifetime capacity factor of about 54%. The capacity factors there have approached 60%. The Kincardine project with the 5 units is located approximately to High Wind Scotland. We'd expect it to see similar capacity factors. And part of the reason that we wanted to show this slide was to demonstrate that not only does offshore wind tend to have higher capacity factors than resources onshore, like onshore wind and solar, but as has been described, typically as one moves further from shore and into deeper waters, the capacity factor increases yet still. So when we compare the High Wind Scotland's capacity factor results from other projects that are in the North Sea or other parts of Europe, we see that there's quite a difference, 10% greater, 14% greater, something like that. Obviously, it's very locationally dependent, but it starts to tell the story of some of the benefits that we see from floating offshore winds. And let's see, as we move into Oregon, trying to move through these slides quickly so we have a chance to take some questions. Walt obviously described this slide really well. We thought that it might be useful to try to make something of an apples to apples comparison. What are the implications of a 45, 55% capacity factor for the state? We thought that we'd try taking a look and comparing that to the capacity factor of some of the onshore resources actually in the state. Took some WEC data and just, some simple averages, and Oregon's solar average capacity factor is less than 25%. Oregon's onshore wind capacity factor is less than 25%. So obviously what you see offshore compares really favorably with the renewable resources that we've relied upon so far. I think one of the reasons we wanted to include this slide in the presentation is to have the opportunity to remind myself to say thank you to BOEM and to congratulate them on the statements that they made last week. These are incredibly important. When we talk about what is it that developers look for as they are moving forward with project development, the first thing that a developer will always say is certainty. And what is it that the supply chain looks for when they're thinking about making investments into their own port facilities, for example? The first thing that they'll say is certainty. They'll say visibility on a pipeline. Visibility on pipeline is what drives investments, which ultimately, again, is what's going to enable us to build these things and deploy them with the cost structures that we have come to expect them achieving, and that will make them fit in an important and productive way into the Oregon grid. So these statements coming from BOEM about their plans, long established plans that have a lot backing them up. I mean, I think there's a lot more time in the planning stages that have gone sort of to the left of this chart than what we see here as just a really important indicator for the industry writ large, not just the development community like our group, but also the members of the supply chain who are trying to understand when and where they should be making the investments that they should, so that they can capture some of the upside of the industry as it grows. From our view, again, Nessie spoke about this really well. Offshore wind in Oregon could be deployed as soon as the late 2020s, early 2030s. So sort of the end of the decade is when we would see the opportunity for floating offshore wind to be deployed off of our coast here in Oregon. Walt described the cost to be as low as around $50 per megawatt hour by 2032. We happen to think that there's still room for additional improvement on those numbers. Walt talked about some of that. We think the 15 megawatt turbines by 2032 is probably quite conservative. I was going to mention the 13 megawatt turbines that will be installed at the Vineyard Wind project south of Massachusetts. Walt also did that for me. And we know that turbine rating is one of the largest drivers of LCOE. So the turbine improvements are key areas where we can see costs decline even further. There's also some reason to expect that floating foundations will be better hosts for wind turbines than bottom fixed turbines. So there may be reasons to think that the capacity can accelerate. The capacity increases can accelerate on floating turbines as opposed to, floating foundations as opposed to the bottom fixed foundations. So with all that, we get to the state itself. And I think one of the key things that we have to recognize is The way that we have to think about Oregon's future is different from the way that we thought about it in the past. We would think about, what is the typical load growth over time, and we'd measure it in the 1s and 2 percentage points, and we'd think about, what is economic growth. There's simply dynamic change that is happening in the way that we use energy and in our expectations of what electricity can provide for us, and also the demands that are now being legislated around the percentage of energy that we use that is of a renewable nature. So not only are we seeing load growth that is, again, changing due to electrification of transportation, and here I am at my house thinking about replacing our, gas-fired oven and, putting in an electric oven. So real changes in load growth due to electrification. We also see, the replacement of thermal generation due to the clean energy mandate. We have to wonder about what's happening with the hydroelectric system. Though the dams have been filled pretty nicely over the last couple of days, long-term drought really appears to be a specter we have to consider in Oregon, not to mention that, what seem to be renewed discussions about the potential to remove some of the dams in the region, and how that might affect, again, where we get the energy that we need to continue to have a thriving economy here in Oregon. And then finally, the resource adequacy demands that we have as a state require valuing the high capacity factor resources. And we've already talked about the role that offshore wind can play in the provision of those high capacity factor resources. Offshore wind also provides the opportunity for us to diversify the resources that we use. The geographic diversity is important. I'm very interested to see the report out from the study that was that Walt was describing, and the prospective value that can come from injecting power on the west side of the grid, and how it can free up other parts of the Oregon's grid to the injection of power in other places. So though the capacity factor that we'd expect to see from offshore wind is higher than what we might expect to see from solar, for example, that doesn't mean that as a state we shouldn't value the opportunity to inject more solar into the system, so long as it's appropriately balanced. So you'll all be familiar with the duck curve image here on the left. It's quite clearly getting worse and worse and worse. The belly of the duck is getting deeper and deeper. And what we've heard is that in California, they've started to call it the dragon curve, just because it's becoming, I guess, more and more frightening. Maybe here in Oregon, we'll always call it the duck curve. But down in Cali, they seem to want to call it the dragon curve these days. So yeah, to make the point, California today sort of serves as the case study for where we may be heading if we don't take advantage of the opportunity to diversify the resources upon which we rely in the state. Transmission being a part of the infrastructure really for offshore wind. Transmission is needed for any renewable energy project that's being developed. I think it was maybe Shannon, even in one of her first slides, started the discussion about how offshore wind can provide some non-wire solutions to the transmission issues that are so key to the reliable performance of our grid. Some of the proposals that we've seen today still require massive investment and probably carry permitting risk as we think about projects carrying power from the far eastern part of our region to the western part of our region. We can talk about the importance of offshore wind and how it provides balancing to the grid and frees up opportunities in other parts of the grid for the injection of renewables. But having that infrastructure in the west also allows for voltage support and these sort of end-of-line communities that I think it was Walt showed with the coastal communities, some earthquake resilience. We know that at some point the big one will strike. Floating structures do quite well, as it happens with moving earth, because they're dissociated from the seabed. And then there's some black start capability that can come from these from offshore wind turbines as well, all of which create greater resilience in the electrical system, not to mention the greater sort of economic resilience that these coastal communities can have if they diversify their own economic base, which I know is not quite the topic of our discussion today. I'm almost done here, recognizing we're just about out of time. So I think a couple other key considerations to make as it relates to offshore wind. We talk about how economies of scale matter for the economics of the projects, but economies of scale can also matter as we try to meet these really aggressive goals that have come out of HB 2021. Offshore wind with a gigawatt scale project, as an example, can be achieved in a single project, allowing for the efficient deployment of capital, as opposed to, and the efficient deployment of resources related to permitting, et cetera, as opposed to the multiple projects that would be required from other renewable energy projects that still might not have the same benefits that we've described and would take maybe 10 solar projects to get to a gigawatt if you're lucky, maybe 4 or 5, additional onshore wind projects to get to a gigawatt if you're lucky. So our conclusion here is if, as the utilities are now required to create these clean energy plans looking forward very progressively and aggressively, offshore wind really should be a part of the evaluation and study that they make. So the regional opportunity, California's passage of AB 525, I assume that many of us on the call have been following that and understand at least what the requirements are under AB 525, if not all of the implications. But essentially what AB 525 requires the California Energy Commission to do is to develop a strategic plan that would include targets and goals for offshore wind installation or capacity numbers by 2030 and 2045. And they have a fairly short time frame under which they need to do that. What's exciting from a California perspective is that through AB 25, they may have the opportunity to be the first mover here and have the benefits that come with first mover status accrue to the states. That may be something that Oregon wants to consider as we think about opportunities here. I guess just in the final kind of concluding slides here, we don't see that offshore wind will require the reinvention of new contract models or anything that's terribly innovative from the PUC and how they regulate what the utilities seek to buy or own. We think that the models exist. Utility ownership and rate basing is possible, we think. PPAs for the output from these projects is clearly possible, whether it be sole source to a single utility, multi-contract schemes where perhaps the power goes to more than one utility in the state, even corporate PPAs. We think that there's no reason to think that all of these different models are not possible for offshore wind, including even short-term contracts, even possibly in the day-ahead market. But what it will require, all of these outcomes will require, is that when RFPs are issued or when these opportunities are being pursued, that the PUC must be prepared to evaluate and value all of the attributes that offshore wind is bringing to the overall grid. And I think this is our sort of message as a developer. The first step is to find a way to include offshore wind in the utilities integrated resource plans and ensure, again, that the values that offshore wind is bringing to the system are properly considered. So we believe that offshore wind should be included in the least cost and least risk analysis to serve the growing load. And again, to include the value of offshore wind against the values of the other generation resources that would be considered under an IRP framework. I realize I spoke very fast and I realize there were a lot of words on those slides. Obviously, these slides will be made available to all of you. I assume that's the case, Shannon. We would like to make these slides available to everyone. And I'm happy to take questions now or I guess later.
Thank you, Kevin. That was awesome. It was a lot to cover. I see that JP and Jason Searman both have their hands up, and certainly the slide deck will be made available. And that was a perfect cue up to why POET's been engaged in the capacity and resource adequacy dockets that we're advocating for that full comprehensive valuation of this resource, and also as a model to how other resources are valued. So JP, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Shannon, this has been great. All the speakers have been fantastic. Thank you very much for doing all this. And Kevin, it's nice to meet you. I'm JP Baumel with the Public Utilities Commission. I guess my question for you is, when you talked about not needing to do anything, you mentioned PPAs, utility ownership exists. Can you give us a taste of what's happening on the East Coast? Were those mandates for offshore wind? Are those developers that have PPAs that the utilities wanted to buy, had to buy? What were the policy mechanisms that went in, and what were the ownership mechanisms that met those policy drivers on the East Coast?
You know what I would like to do? I would like to defer to my colleague Stephanie McClellan, who's on the call, who I think was a part of a lot of the policy development that led to what we've seen unfold on the East Coast. And Steph, if you're there and available to speak, I'd love for you to take that.
Hi, sure. Steph McClellan, JP. I think in answer to your first question, for nearly every state, from Massachusetts on down, I think with the exception really of Rhode Island, they put into place offshore wind carve-outs, understanding that they needed to have, for whether or not it was a state Global Warming Solution Act, Clean Energy Standard, whatever that policy driver was, they determined how much offshore wind they needed and then created a carve-out for that. The mechanism by which states then engaged in contracts for that under that authority are different in different states. So Massachusetts, for example, they use bilateral PPAs between utilities and developers. Other states, have instituted offshore renewable energy credits, ORECs, and New York, I think, has been the most creative, I would say, in really making sure that the OREC type of mechanism that they used is as market-based as possible. So I would just say there's a very wide variety, a long continuum of approaches to PPAs that these states have taken. But it has always started with understanding how much offshore wind would be needed. Well, what was going to be needed to reach their clean energy goals, where
Right.
offshore wind sat within that need, and then developing the policy or the contract mechanisms that were fit for purpose for that state. So happy to answer any other questions, but I think that's the overall.
That's great, Stephanie. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to meet you. And I won't take any more time from Jason other than ask one more question. Just following up on that, were any of those plans driven by 100% clean? Like it was, aside from decarbonization, did they say, hey, we did like a massive integrated resource plan for the state or for, the utilities we oversee, and X number of gigawatts fits within the state's overarching plan to get, in our case, to 100% clean? Was that ever the policy driver for it, or was more like kind of just a certain percent of the total energy mix should be offshore wind?
No, it started with, whether or not in Massachusetts it was the Global Warming Solutions Act, right, which said, and these have all changed over time, right? So we're talking way back in 2013, 2014. These states were putting these laws into place. Now they've gone back and changed them again. So New York, for example, theirs was a clean energy standard, reaching 70% clean energy by 2030. That was the first time that a 2.4 gigawatt target of offshore wind sort of appeared in New York. Well, then they moved to 100% clean energy standard and had to do the math again to say how many gigawatts of offshore wind. Now they've added on to that the deep decarbonization, right? And they're having to change that denominator again of what load is going to look like. So it's really always driven by a clean energy standard, and then figuring out in these states on the East Coast that are very congested, there's very little room for other types of large scale resources, land-based wind, for example. So they really look and they say, how are we going to meet this? And have always come to that conclusion that offshore wind is fit for purpose.
If I can just speak, this is Nessie, JP. If you're not already aware, the California Integrated Resource Planning process has begun to incorporate offshore wind. And so, that is probably the other venue that you're thinking about, is that it's going to be driven by modeling. So they're doing Resolve. And so the last IRP had a policy sensitivity case for offshore wind. And so I expect that with more information on transmission costs, the next cycle, which should begin, I believe, pretty soon, like early next year, could actually put offshore wind as a default resource that could be selected under resolve.
I was gonna say thank you. That's awesome. That's a great breadcrumb trail. Appreciate it.
And Jason Searman, you have a question.
Hey, thanks. So a little different question than before, but it kind of hovers around the same topic of the capital backing behind some of these emerging technologies. And appreciate JP's comments and the end of Kevin's presentation where we kind of started talking about IRPs. Don't want to steal anybody's thunder at the PUC, but I did want to maybe talk about Oregon IRPs, or tee up someone maybe at PUC to talk about this. So. And I will recognize that hydrogen, I added that to my list. So there's like 4 or 5 nexuses with oil and gas and offshore wind, hydrogen being a big one. Shocked I didn't mention that earlier. But
Frankly, I should have mentioned it myself.
So yeah, the Oregon IRPs, and not to start this little observation or question I have, thinking it's one or the other, all these technologies compete against each other. But in PacifiCorp's recent IRP, they acknowledge that they're in early stages with TerraPower and U.S. Department of Energy on a nuclear reactor with some storage potential, molten salt, kind of like a demonstration project. That's about all I know, enough to tee up this question. I don't know the details, where the funding, the structure of all this. But I do know it was appetizing enough from a ratepayer's perspective or from PacifiCorp's kind of back of the envelope, I'm guessing, estimation of the potential cost that it, is viable enough to consider an IRP, as far as its impact to ratepayers, which is one of the things PUC focuses on. And TerraPower is based out of Washington. NuScale is based in Portland. Both these entities have relationships, are in the process of building them with utilities in the region. And I'm not exactly sure about NuScale's capital backing, but TerraPower is backed by Bill Gates, some big tech money, so they could be very well capitalized. So I guess what I'm wondering is, to the extent maybe from your future plans or what you've done before with outreach, like how are well capitalized offshore wind companies like yourself engaging with utilities in the region?
How are we engaging with utilities in the region?
Yeah, because I understood, and again, I'm not sure if Rose is still on the phone. She's really great. Probably the lead as far as I know. There might be a couple others intimately working on PacifiCorp's IRP, but the gist I got from the way it was presented was, they were approached by US DOE and TerraPower, or I don't know who did the approaching, but it was like this relationship and this outreach that really maybe helped put the nuclear demonstration project on the map for them, recognizing that land-based transmission access is probably a big part of that, right? I mean, offshore wind transmission is a big challenge. So anyway, I'm just wondering what you guys are doing in your plans for outreach to like PG&E.
Yeah, I mean, I think
other folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in sort of the outreach phase, and it's not really a sort of and I'm not suggesting that you're saying that it is. It's not really a check the box exercise, right? It's a continual exercise, and I think this type of meeting is really important. And I think what utilities in the region, they haven't been perhaps as exposed to how far the offshore wind industry has sort of traveled over the last really half decade, and so we're starting to have those conversations now. With presentations similar to what we've talked about now. And we want to really understand what it is that the utilities want to understand. How are they seeing risk from the perspective that they see risk? And we're preparing ourselves to answer those questions. So I guess it's fair to say it's early days, but given the landscape that we see in the state, we've had a lot of receptivity to the outreach that we've initiated so far.
Yeah. So other PUC, people might have more information, but it was my observation, the couple meetings I was at, that people were pretty surprised to see it contemplated in their IRP, because it's emerging and, not something that there's a lot of experience with yet, and the costs are pretty high. So I think, I'm not personally doing it, but I think a lot of people are looking at them as like, maybe apples and oranges, but similar, around the corner technologies, and just,
And
I don't want to derail us, but yeah, I just thought it'd be worth mentioning.
Well, and Jason, I appreciate the comment, because I think part of the job that we have as developers is to describe that, offshore wind and floating offshore wind may be new to Oregon. I would argue that it's not so new to Oregon, but may appear new to Oregon, but it's not new around the world. And so, Walt was talking about how today there's, call it 200 megawatts that are already deployed and operational around the globe. Every year, those numbers are going to increase pretty significantly. So by the time that we're actually talking about deploying something off the Oregon coast, call it the end of the decade, there will be gigawatts that are deployed elsewhere. And all of the experience that we've been able to gain to date to give us the confidence to move forward with development planning now will also be brought to bear, not only through the development process, but through the construction, installation, and operations process. So, by the end of the decade, floating offshore wind will be a mature industry. So that's a big part of what we need to do as we progress our plans. I don't want to call it evangelism, because it's not belief, but it's education, because it's based on facts, and it's things that are happening, have happened, continue to happen elsewhere. We're lucky to be able to bring that experience with us as we contemplate a future for floating in Oregon.
Kevin, this is Jason. This is exactly Jason's point. Jason Searman's point is a good one regarding the utilities. And this is exactly why POET took up the opportunity from Bonneville Environmental Foundation to convene the utility sector and give them an opportunity to come together and have access to the data, direct access to the companies, to hear from folks like Walt Musial, and get them up to speed on the status of this sector and the speed with which it's developing, and make them essentially help them become comfortable with this new opportunity, and hopefully expedite the speed with which they begin to include offshore wind in their planning. So the Ford effort, as it's called, is launching soon. So that's going to be a great opportunity, and we hope it serves this purpose of educating the utilities.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all of you. We ran way over time, which I should have foreseen. This was wonderful. Thank all of our presenters, and huge thanks to JP and Rose at the PUC for helping us pull this together. Hopefully you'll be able to join us next week. We've got another all-star lineup, and we will be making all of the slide decks available to you all. And if you have any other questions or follow-up, feel free to reach out to any of us.
Can I make one last comment, Shannon? Shannon, can I make one last comment? So
sure.
I'm almost embarrassed to bring this up. Next Thursday, there's actually an offshore wind sort of get together in Portland. So I'll be there. Other colleagues from the industry will be meeting at a place called the Space Room Lounge on Hawthorne next Thursday evening. I know that's not convenient for everybody, and I'm sure that we'll plan to do this in other parts around the state, but there's sort of a surprising number, and there's a sort of a surprising, call it cluster of offshore wind industry folks that already exist, already live and work here in Oregon. And so I think this will be, one of the first times that we avail ourselves of the opportunity to get together and just and talk as a community. So it's an invitation that's open to all. Simply Blue is a part of the sort of the organization of this event. POET is a part of the organization of this event. Renewable Northwest is a part of the organization of this event, and some others. I only mention them because I know we have representatives from each of those groups on the call. Some others are also involved. So open invitation. There's some information on my LinkedIn profile. I'm a little embarrassed to say that, but it's there. And so hope to see you. Thanks.
Well, actually, Kevin, that's a great point. I have the invitation, and thank you for bringing it up. I was planning on sending that out to all of the invitees to this meeting next week. So hopefully if you're in the Portland area, we'll see you next Thursday too for some after hours, happy kilowatt hours. All right. Well, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate all your time on this. Thank you, JP. We'll see y'all next week. And thank you, Jason E., for taking the helm when I was kicked off of Zoom. I don't know what happened, but thank goodness everyone else was able to stay here. Bye, y'all.
Thank you, Shannon. Bye-bye.